welcome to Web of Tomorrow. I'm Adam Garrett Harris, and today we're talking with Kyle Mathews, the creator of Gatsby JS.
Hey everyone.
So, what is Gatsby?
Gatsby is a blazing fast React static site generator, and it aims to give you a really nice out-of-the-box experience where you can everything set up for you. React, Webpack, different, CSS options, modern JavaScript, etc. And you can build really fast sites without a lot of effort on your part.
Cool. So, how did you get the idea for Gatsby?
Basically, so I started using React pretty early. So it was open sourced mid 2013, and kind of, got on my radar then. And I was working at a job in San Francisco at a startup, building JavaScript web applications with Backbone. And I really liked it in a lot of ways, but it had a lot of kind of weird sharp edges / missing things. And React just came along and I was like, this is so beautiful. The component model, it just because Backbone a lot of people components is an old idea. React didn't invent the idea of components, but no one had really, Backbone components existed, but they were kind of just missing a lot of stuff. Anyway, so React components was just this is so beautiful. And so so I started following that, and I quit that job early 2014 and just started doing a bunch of stuff with React. I was this is the future. This is what I want to learn, do everything with. And then kind of mid-ish 2014, a friend and I, we started working on a startup. And so anyways, worked on that for a while, and I was building our web application with React, of course. And then kind of early 2015, it was kind of getting to a point where okay, we're we kind of know what we're doing. We're gonna we have an application started working, start to go public pretty soon. And of course you need a website. And I was okay, I haven't built a website in a while. How do people do that these days? And I was looking around, I was oh man, I hate all these things, because I'd use Drupal and WordPress and built my own little static site generator in the past. And I was these are all terrible. I want to use React components and Webpack and all these other really nice modern tools. And anyways, and so there was other people thinking about the same thing at the time. And I just thought about it a bunch, and I figured out kind of clever way to pull all those together. And so that was the first version of Gatsby that I built just for my startup's website. And then I open sourced that, and then a lot of other people got interested, and just kind of snowballed from there.
Cool. So what is the tech behind Gatsby? You mentioned React. What else?
So the goal of Gatsby is that it is to use pretty standard, industry standard stuff. With the idea being that if you're a React web application developer, you can install and use Gatsby, and it feels completely natural. That's what I wanted. I'd already learned Webpack and React, how to use those two together, and loaders and so forth, for the applications that I've been building. So it's that's what I wanted from Gatsby. And so it uses React and then Webpack for module bundling, and then normal standard loaders and so forth. So so if you build a React Webpack, Babel web app, then using Gatsby should feel pretty,
and then it also has Redux and GraphQL, right?
So the latest version of Gatsby, it adds Redux, but that's just for kind of managing internal state. While using Gatsby, you shouldn't see Redux at all. And GraphQL is also new addition to the new major version of Gatsby that was released recently. And GraphQL is used very much if you've seen Relay or Apollo, those kind of clients for building stuff on the web. It works pretty similar. That on React or on Gatsby page or React page components in Gatsby, you can have a query which says, for this page, for this, blog index page, or for this, product overview page, here's, the query describes the data that is needed for that page. And then Gatsby makes sure, while you're developing and, in production, that when that page gets rendered, the data that you queried for is there.
Cool. All right. So who is Gatsby for? Who do you want to be using this? What kind of stuff can you build with Gatsby? So the first version of Gatsby was kind of like intended for, basically my mindset was, hey, React developers who also want to build websites. So you want to have like kind of like a static render of everything. You have your different React pages, and you can like throw in some Markdown as well. And you just want to have a static render of that so that it loads faster. That was kind of like the main use case that I had in mind for the first version of Gatsby. But Gatsby V1 is much more ambitious. The latest version, in that it adds the ability to like pull data from like remote APIs. And this is really important because most websites in the world are like powered by content management systems. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is like, it's not just, one or two developers who are like cranking out a site. I mean, there's lots of those, of course, but the vast majority of websites in the world are like big, complex operations, mm-hmm. with like dozens or even hundreds of people who have their hands on all sorts of, different pieces of it. And they need like specialized tools for managing the content, which we know is content management systems. And so for any like website building tool to like actually make it kind of outside of the little niche of, programmers messing around with stuff, you need the ability to integrate with content management systems. And so that's like kind of one of the major focuses of Gatsby V1, to be able to do that. And so, which is already paid off, because I've seen there's a number of agencies that are like working on Gatsby WordPress sites where they're using WordPress as the CMS, okay. And then like building like the actual site in Gatsby. So they get advantage of kind of like modern JavaScript and CSS and like the React component model, but they still have the familiar WordPress ecosystem to like set up, the actual content editing experience for their clients. Mm-hmm. And they've been really happy with that. And there's also a lot of like kind of like new startups offering like CMSs that are like headless, basically, where they don't have, all they are is like the content editing, part and an API. They don't have like, WordPress is like that piece plus like, everything around like actually building and running the website. Mm-hmm. And those like work really, really well with Gatsby because, they concentrate on having a really nice interface for like creating and editing content. And then Gatsby has a really nice, tool set for building really fast websites. Cool.
So to your question, the audience is pretty much anyone building any sort of website.
Especially if you want to be fast.
Yeah, especially if you want to be fast, which is pretty much everyone.
Yeah.
It's also an interesting, I think, fit for kind of like hybrid website web apps. There's several startups that are building their like everything basically on Gatsby. So they have like their marketing site, that's like static, but then Gatsby V1 also has kind of the ability to have like client only sections of the site, which is then just a traditional web app, that loads up and then hits an API and then, mm-hmm. does its thing from there.
Yeah, because you're just building it in React.
Yeah, and it's just all React, and so it just works.
That's cool, because I've seen companies in the past build their marketing site with Jekyll, but they clearly couldn't make their app with Jekyll.
Exactly, yeah. And there's a ton of like inefficiencies through that model because you have different programming languages, you have different like models of thinking about things, you have different build steps, you have to like have the problem of like merging styles back and forth and mm-hmm. this, that, and the other thing. And if everything's in Gatsby, you can reuse the same like layout components and other components across the whole site. It's the same styles, it's the same way of thinking about the world. So mm-hmm. there's no like friction. There's a lot of companies that's like the marketing site is like the redheaded stepchild sort of thing, where marketing people are always begging engineer times like, hey, somebody come work on our site, and they don't want to because it's like it's this like big abrupt shift to like, oh, how does this stupid thing work again? It's like. And anyways, but if everything's the same, it's like everything kind of moves along together, and it's a much cleaner, more efficient model.
Cool.
Okay, so why is Gatsby so fast?
Great question. There's a few ways to answer that. First is like Gatsby as a static site generator inherits kind of all the speed advantages of static sites, which is, basically it's like, so if you think about how a website gets loaded, it's like person A is like somewhere in the world, and like there's, they type in the browser a site, and there's DNS resolution, and then there's a little HTTP request that sends on the packet over the the internet, and like gets routed to a server somewhere, which then does some work and then sends back files or it sends back data, and then that comes to the browser and gets all assembled, and the browser like pulls it all together and like spits renders pixels on the screen, which then we see as the website. So why static sites in general are fast is because they avoid doing any work on the server. So if you have kind of like a site that's run by a code that runs for each response, there's like cost from like running the code, and especially if there's like database queries that has to be run before data can be sent back to the client. So static sites avoids that because it's like request comes in, and then you just load files off the disk and then send that back, which is like super duper fast compared to like running queries and like running code and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so like I thought Jekyll was super fast because it's static.
Yeah.
But then Gatsby like takes it to another level.
Yeah. So Gatsby gets a lot from that, but Gatsby also, it tries to bake in. So it does several things. First, it tries to like enforce everyone using, all the kind of like the best performance techniques. So like one example is like by default Gatsby inline CSS in the head. So you're not making like most sites you have like an HTTP request and then it loads in and then it like loads, then it does another request for CSS and JavaScript and so forth. But it's actually much faster if you inline CSS into the head of the HTML. And Gatsby does some like nice tricks to make that really easy to do. And so that saves, oftentimes like 300 to 750 milliseconds on the initial, paint time. So that's something that most people don't even know about and like definitely aren't doing, and that Gatsby just does for you. So there's a few other tricks like that Gatsby does. But the other big thing is that Gatsby is kind of a universal JavaScript. So it has like, it can render your site, at build time to HTML, but it can also render in the client. So once Gatsby loads, all subsequent pages are rendered in the client and not on the server. And so that means that there's like no latency at all when clicking on different pages. Gatsby just like prefetches all the data and code needed for each new page. So when you click on it, there's no like request to the internet at that point. It's just like, assembling the new page in your browser and then whoop, there it is. And so frequently, that's like 30, 50 milliseconds versus, if you have to go back to the internet to get stuff for the new page, you're looking at least like 100, but oftentimes, especially on mobile, like 500, 500 milliseconds, 1,000 milliseconds, that sort of thing.
Don't you have another project that helps make websites faster with web fonts?
Yeah, that's the typefaces. Yeah. The basic idea is that, self-hosting your fonts is faster almost always than like Google fonts.
Yeah, I had no idea. I thought it's just getting it from somewhere, so why is it slower from Google?
So the reason is that like what Google Fonts gives you is a CSS file. So anyways, when you add Google Fonts to a site, it adds basically a CSS file that Google hosts. And so you first have to make a request to get that CSS file. And then in that CSS file, there's like then links to the actual font files for whatever font that you want to add to your site. And so Google Fonts is like always like 2 requests before you start, before you have the fonts. And then when you self-host, and with like inlining it, it's like the request to anyways, there's no additional request. I guess it's just like you load the page, and then there's the links right already there to the font files.
Yeah.
So just avoids extra request.
So you mentioned you could get data from external APIs,
mm-hmm.
and then you are going to generate static sites
mm-hmm.
locally instead of on the server and push up those static files. But what happens when that data changes from the time you build it to the time a user visits the site? Do they get the old data and then it flickers for a second and gets the new data?
So no. So Gatsby, is a static site generator. So it's you're kind of outputting static bundles. Like the whole site, is just HTML and JavaScript and JSON and that sort of thing. So basically you need to rebuild the site every time there's a change. And so basically you could think of as versions of the site. So if user A loads version, 273, then they'll be navigating within version 273. Mm-hmm. And if there's a change to content or to code or whatever, version 274 is out.
Okay.
Then they won't see that until they reload the site.
Okay. So if you build the Gatsby site and then someone makes change on the CMS, maybe they're using WordPress as a CMS, the site will not be updated until you build Gatsby again.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Have people come up with a way to automate that?
Yeah, that's actually, so a lot of people are doing that. Basically, you just need to have a build server of some sort, and there's a few services that do that, like Netlify. And then you have a webhook from your CMS that then just triggers a rebuild on your build server. And so it's fairly straightforward to do. I know some people also do a cron job, which is another option if your data doesn't change that often.
Okay. And a cron job would just run at a certain interval, every night or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
But generally speaking, a webhook works really well and is fairly straightforward to set up. Most CMSs, especially the API CMSs, they're already set up to do this out of the box. And
and then you probably get an email if something didn't build right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. So one question I'm really interested in is that a year ago you announced you're working on Gatsby full time.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you make money, if you don't mind?
No, that's a great question.
Because I think it seems like you're kind of living the dream.
Yeah.
You're just I'm just going to quit my job and do this open source project.
Yeah. Basically it's been a few different sources. There's been a number of companies who've been, who are really interested in the plans for 1.0 and have either directly sponsored it or pay me to work on projects using the kind of work in progress 1.0 code. And that's been the majority of funding. So that's been what I've been doing so far. But this is the tricky thing about open source is that, you really need, for an open source project to really take off, you really need at a minimum of hundreds of thousands of dollars investment, and you get some of that, of course, if you have lots of people using it and lots of people submitting PRs, they're individually, it's if you think about the time value of these different PRs that people are contributing, each PR is minimum of hundreds of dollars in investment. And some mid to major type PRs, they could easily be thousands of dollars of time that these really talented engineers are contributing to the open source project. So there's definitely lots of investment.
So how much learning is involved with Gatsby to get going with Gatsby? Say you don't know React. Is React all you need to know, or what else?
You definitely have to have probably even a fairly beginner level of understanding of React should be sufficient, because most of the time you're just using React components, and you really can use just like the function, React components for most stuff. So like basic understanding of JavaScript, basic understanding of React, some understanding of Webpack is helpful, especially if you want to do like more complicated things. And then past that, it's really how far you want to go in different directions.
Okay. How much of the Gatsby API do you need to know?
Again, it depends. Like if it's a fairly simple site, like perhaps not at all, you just like, start using Gatsby, and then you add a few plugins, and then you just write React components and then build it, and off you go. But if you want to like start writing like custom plugins, then of course you're gonna have to dive into the APIs.
Yeah.
So the goal is that the plugin system is like robust enough that as time goes on, more and more use cases will be solved by just installing a plugin.
Yeah. So I was looking through the post on the Gatsby blog about how to get started making a Gatsby blog. And a lot of it is just installing Gatsby plugins.
Yeah.
But it still seems fairly intensive as far as install all of these, and then here's all this boilerplate code to wire it all up.
Yeah. And so I actually have a plugin in mind that will remove most of that boilerplate.
Okay.
So that's the goal. I just with like all the work just getting Gatsby out, period. I left it kind of boilerplate-y. But the idea is that any boilerplate can be subsumed within a plugin.
Yeah.
Is kind of the goal.
I think it's also kind of cool because even though it is boilerplate, it describes exactly what your site is doing, and you can change it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's not super opinionated. It doesn't say how you have to name your files or where you put your files or how things go or what a post is or what a page. You can do whatever.
Yeah. So like, I think the right, because like there's always this like there's this trade-off between like you have use cases and like we'll build around those use cases, and then those use cases are very easy to accomplish. But then, if I want to step outside of those kind of like, blessed paths, then all of a sudden, like, life is hard.
Yeah.
And a lot of systems kind of end up in that kind of, that trap, I guess. We call it trap. And I didn't want that to happen with Gatsby. So what I think, like, the best pattern is that you have pretty low-level primitives that you decide, like, these are, like, these, like, basic things are what constitute, is what the system supports. And then you add kind of, like, scaffolding tools, I guess, that then you can build up abstractions on top of, you can build up arbitrary abstractions on top of those lower-level constructs. And so, like, you think of, like, a programming language, like, programming languages are awesome. Like, they're all like, completely designed around this. Like, they give you, like, different data types. Like, you have strings, you have ints, you have floats, and you have, like, functions and whatever. And then using these, like, little, like, pretty low-level stuff, you can then build up, any sort of abstraction on top of that. Yeah. And it works, super well. And so you can think of, like, Gatsby as, like, kind of in that same sort of thing, where Gatsby's like, hey, you have pages, you have layouts, you have data of various sorts. You have like queries, that you can like query your data and pull data into, your components. And then using these like kind of like site specific primitives, then you can like build up abstractions on top of that.
Cool. So you said you can pull data from APIs, but you can also just have local data, and then you got your pages and posts. So describe queries. How do you use that data?
So interesting thing about like the local stuff is that in the Gatsby world, like data coming from like your local file system is treated exactly the same as data coming from remote APIs.
Cool.
Like as far as Gatsby is concerned, it's just data that just arrives from somewhere. So So Gatsby's data system is basically there's source plugins and then there's transformer plugins. And so source plugins, their responsibility is like somewhere out there in the world there's data and it pulls it in somehow. And it's up to the source plugin how it does that. It could use carrier pigeons or probably doesn't, but probably uses like JavaScript, NPM libraries or something, or API calls to get stuff. So in the case of like a file system, we, the source file system plugin, you just tell it what directory to look at, and then it goes through that, directory and recursively finds all the files, and then adds those as files. Adds those as nodes, which is nodes, like the basic Gatsby data type, into Gatsby, and then those are usable. But like for remote source plugin, it would just hit an API and then pull in the data from there, and then somehow turn that into, again, nodes, which then go into Gatsby. Mm-hmm. And then transformer plugins, how they work is that source plugins can say, hey, I know how to handle I know how to completely handle my data. And so I'm just going to add them as all the data is already kind of like decomposed into fields. And so there's no more kind of decomposition that can happen. It's like there's a title field and then there's a date field and this, that, and the other thing. And it's already kind of in its final state. But there's often times where you have data that, a source plugin's well, I don't really know exactly what the end user wants to do with this. And so I'm going to kind of leave it in kind of mm-hmm. unconverted form, like raw source form that then can be converted per the needs of an individual site. So Markdown is a really obvious example of this because it's pretty common. So a source plugin can say, hey, I have this node and it's Markdown and I'm not going to do anything with it. It's just here's Markdown.
Mm-hmm.
But this node is has this raw content that's Markdown. Then a transformer plugin can come along and say, hey, I know how to transform Markdown into something else, which of course typically is HTML. So there's transformer plugins that take this raw content, Markdown, and then turn it into HTML. And so it basically says, here's a node that's of type Markdown, and I'm going to transform it into a new node that's of type HTML.
Got it.
And so this can be these sort of transformations can happen from any one data type to another data type. So there's a CSV transformer which takes a CSV file and turns mm-hmm. it into each row is now a new node. Same thing JSON, YAML. There's image transformer plugins which take an image and then can turn it into resize the image, can turn down the grayscale, can do basically anything that you want.
Is that all done with JavaScript?
Not necessarily. It can be done with JavaScript. For the image case, there's this npm package called Sharp, which kind of anyways, it uses another really kind of older
Image Magic or something.
It's not using image. It's libvips or something like that.
Okay.
Anyways, it's super fast and it's it's pretty easy to install across platforms. So
yeah,
it handles a lot of the image transformation. But you could totally write one with Image Magic if you want. But anyways, yeah. So it's so you have source nodes and then you have transformer nodes which take data and turn it into other sorts of data. Anyways, and this all eventually kind of this kind of chain of transformations is just kind of automatically happens using all the plugins that you install. And then out of that comes then a GraphQL schema, which is all the different types of data that you add and all the fields that you have gets turned into this schema. And so it's kind of one way of thinking about it is you're basically constructing on the fly a database.
Yeah.
With all your data and all the transformations of the data. And then you then have a database schema, which in this case is powered by GraphQL. And then kind of old school PHP or something like that. Then when you're creating pages, then you can just write queries directly against your database to pull in the data that you want. And so GraphQL is like a really nice query language for that.
Yeah, because that would just pull in the parts you need.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're like, oh, I need a list of all the authors,
Mm-hmm.
you can do it.
Yeah.
Tags for the pages, tags that are within those pages, or pages that are within those tags.
Yeah.
Like some stuff that can be really hard with a static site generator.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You just come up with an idea of what you want to query for, and then you got it.
Yeah. Yeah, because that was like... Yeah, that was one of the big motivations for this new data layer in the whole GraphQL system is that, yeah, like static site generators are really nice for simple sites because it's like, it's very simple. It's just like, oh, you have data and you like put it through templates and out comes pages.
And they're assuming the kind of data that you want.
Yeah.
I mean, they let you put some custom markdown and stuff, but querying it's not that easy.
Yeah. But yeah, these kind of like the idea of like jumping across lots of different files or lots of different data sources, to like query like all authors or, all posts created by an author or all posts where a tag shows up, that sort of stuff. That gets like weird to do in static site, traditional static site generators. And so the GraphQL stuff makes it that like really trivial to do. And it also makes it trivial to do all sorts of like complex data transformations that are like just powered by plugins and are performant and cached and so forth.
So, what are there other types of plugins besides the what you call it source?
Yeah,
besides source and transform.
Yeah, so there's plugins that are for the data layer. So those are the source and transformer plugins, and those are responsible for like fetching data and then transforming data in different ways. Mm-hmm. So those are most plugins, but then there's also plugins for kind of two other categories, I guess, would be like Webpack related plugins. So, if you want to set up like, if you want to use less, for example, there's in Webpack world, there's a less loader that you use to then like add support for, transform for kind of like Webpack lingo, loading less files and like doing different stuff to it. And so there's actually not a Gatsby less plugin yet, but so maybe that's a better example since someone's written that. But anyways, there's a Gatsby SaaS plugin, which does all the setup for using SaaS in your site. And then there's also another category of plugins for like kind of like solving miscellaneous, website problems. So for example, like adding Google Analytics. Mm-hmm. There's just a Gatsby plugin which will add it to, like at the end of your body and all the kind of normal stuff. Mm-hmm. All you have to do is say, okay, here's my, here's the tracking ID, and then, it happens. And then there's like an offline plugin, which generates, a service worker automatically. That's like set up for your site. So you add that, and all of a sudden your site works offline. Cool. So, anyways, there's a whole bunch. There's a very long list of random, stuff like that that plugins can handle.
Cool. So when you decided to make Gatsby, how hard was it, and how did you figure it out? And did you think you would be able to do it?
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely many moments where I doubted. I was just like, man, it's just, I don't know. Whenever you do like something novel, it's like, you really don't know what you're getting yourself into. And so it's both hard, like both like the unknowns, just you don't know how long the pathway is or what you're going to encounter along the way. And so there's a lot of, fears associated with like kind of like that unknown, that unknownness of the path. It's like, am I going to have enough resources to get through? Like, will I be able to like, is it actually solvable? It's like, when I started Gatsby, the next major version of Gatsby, I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do, but it's like, is it actually doable? Like all these things that I want to make happen.
Yeah, I think for me, I wouldn't think, is it doable, but can I do it?
Yeah. No, yeah, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I I don't know. I'm very much, I think most people are capable of doing a lot more than they think they can. It's just letting yourself believe that, and then, putting in the time.
Yeah.
To get there. And there's definitely, I had to learn a ton of stuff to do Gatsby. I mean, there's a lot of kind of like code techniques I hadn't used before that I didn't even necessarily know existed. But I guess the thing is, it's like, if you can overcome your fear of the unknown and just kind of like plunge in, it's kind of like you dive in, and then, I mean, you can't see the path that you're going to take necessarily, but like, once you get there, either you can like cut your way through, or you can like go around obstacles. Or I don't know. There's a lot of metaphors you can use here, but basically, it's like, as long as you like allow yourself the time to learn things, you can do a lot more than you think you can. It's like, if other people, people who do stuff that you haven't done, it isn't because they're like smarter than you necessarily. It's because, for whatever reason, they've had the opportunity to learn the skills and knowledge necessary to do those things. And so if you allow yourself the time to learn those skills and knowledge, then, there's lots you can do.
Cool. So when you started this, did you have a full-time job, and then you were just doing it on the side?
No. So we talked earlier about the startup. So I built the first version of Gatsby just to build that website, basically. And so I started working on the next major version of Gatsby that was just released a few weeks ago, when I quit that startup.
Okay.
And so I quit that startup, and I was like looking around for like, okay, what's the next big thing I'm going to do? And Gatsby seemed kind of like, it's just like there's tons of changes right now around how we build stuff for the web. And a lot of kind of like the mainstays of, tools for building websites, like WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, a whole host of like proprietary tools, like they just don't work as well anymore for, with all the, the smartphone, like all like how we're all shifted to using smartphones all the time. The billions of people coming online, in other countries that are like on smartphones, on like, crappy networks and so forth. Like, anyways, like most of the old tools assume you're on a desktop and have a reliable network connection. Mm-hmm. And like when you shift away from that world, all of a sudden these sites get super slow. Like I profiled just, this like Downy.com a while ago, and it was like on a 3G network on a smartphone, it was like 18 seconds or something to load, which is just crazy.
Yeah. Which
is just insane. It's like you have this like really pretty high profile site that's just like, horrendously unoptimized. Anyways, the point is, like, I was kind of looking around, I was like, oh, like all the, like tons of companies know that they need to have their websites work fast on mobile, and they just don't have the tools to do it. Mm-hmm. And like really technically advanced companies are like figuring out, they're just building stuff custom in-house, but that's only a few small percentage of companies that are able to do that.
Yeah,
they have kind of the engineering talent and vision and I guess like the critical need to spend the $500K or something to build their own framework in-house to power things. And so
I noticed. I know something else that's really cool about Gatsby is if you turn off JavaScript, it still works.
Yeah.
At least the initial like page loads and all the links work. It just does a full network request.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. That's something you get from the static site generation. Yeah, that is really cool.
Are you familiar with Next.js?
Yeah, loosely. I haven't used it for anything, but I mean, it's in this kind of.
Do you have a comparison between Next and Gatsby?
Not that I've ever written down, but I mean, just there's a number of people who asked about this, so it's it's something I've thought about and have discussions with people about. And I think on the whole, they have very similar goals, and that you want to be able to like easily create websites that are fast using React. And I guess the big difference is that, Gatsby is very focused on kind of like the static site goal. The coming version of Next adds a static kind of export, which is like similar. I'm not entirely sure on the details of that, but anyways, it seems like fairly similar to what Gatsby does. But I think like the biggest differentiator is Next doesn't have an opinion on data loading. It just gives you like a function that it calls when it wants data, and then you give it data. And so that's always a very do-it-yourself operation. Where Gatsby has the whole data layer and graphical system and like all the source and transformer plugins to make it very easy to get data from wherever it is into your site. So yeah, so I think because a website without data isn't much of anything.
No.
And so
it's nothing.
Yeah. So I think that's that's been like the major focus of all the work we've been doing on Gatsby. Because in Gatsby V1 it also adds like code splitting and like a few other things. But honestly, all that stuff was done in like a few weeks, last August.
Okay.
And then like the remaining like 9-10 months of work was all around, like this whole data layer and plugin system.
Yeah.
Because that's the real roadblock, I think, for most sites is like, getting data to the right place at the right time. And why Gatsby V1 is so fast that, it just handles behind the scene, like getting the data loaded at the right time and in the right place so that, when you click around, everything's just like
Is it like prefetching data?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just because it like knows...
It knows like what links are on the page.
Yeah.
And then it gets the data for those.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works. Like, it just like, it knows, so you land on a page and it says, well, Gatsby's like, hey, you're linking to these other pages, so I'm going to start prefetching the data for each one of those pages. Data and sometimes code for all those pages, so that when you click on it, everything's already there to go.
Cool. So one thing I love about Gatsby is how you've got your pages directory, and then inside of there you kind of just make a folder for each post or page, and then that way, like for normal Markdown posts, your images are right there next to the post. But then also you could just, instead of doing a Markdown, you could do a JavaScript file for a post.
Yeah. That's.
I mean, you could just have a live demo inside the post.
Yeah, exactly.
Pull in a component or whatever.
Yeah, and that's something I like. Yeah, that was like number one. When I first started working on Gatsby, I was like, that would be so cool. Just you drop a React component and it turns into a page. It's a very straightforward way to think about things. Yeah, and a lot of people seem to like it.
So why is it called Gatsby?
So yeah, people often ask is there some sort of story behind it? And really, there's not. Actually, amusingly, I hadn't even read Gatsby, the book, The Great Gatsby, before I started working on Gatsby, the open source project. It was really just I was starting a project and I was like, okay, what am I going to name this? And I was like, I really like books, literature of all sorts. And
just not that one, apparently.
Yeah. Actually, so I've read the book since then. And I was kind of like, why do people read this? Why is it so famous? It's just kind of like weird people with weird problems.
Yeah.
I'm like, these guys are immature.
Yeah.
It's like, Gatsby is just, he's not...
It's a fun movie, though.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes for an entertaining book, I guess, and movie. But anyways, so yeah, I just Googled literary names, famous literary names, and I just went through the list and was like, which ones sound good, are kind of memorable and sound good, and then also, which ones don't already have an NPM package and website and Twitter handle.
Yeah.
And Gatsby fit all those things. So I was like, Gatsby, that's a fun name and it's easy to remember. And anyways, so kind of went from there.
Awesome. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
Use Gatsby, make pull requests. And
yeah, I mean, didn't you have 13 contributors on this V1?
No, a lot more than that actually. There was like...
Or maybe I'm thinking of 1.3.
Yeah, just in the latest minor release, there was... no, it's been... For before the 1.0 release, there was something like 40, 50 people contributing to the initial stuff, and since then there have been like 30-ish, I haven't made the exact count, but somewhere in the 30s, I think, contributors since, just in the last like 3 weeks.
Cool. Do you have helpful links for how to get started contributing or easy pull requests to get started on or anything like that?
So probably the easiest way to get going is just, there's a long list of plugins that can be written, and example sites. And so there's an issue, for, just people brainstorming, different stuff that could be built. And so that would be kind of a fun place to start.
So the plugins in the example sites, would those be a part of the Gatsby org or just your own repo that you make? So
example sites are to demonstrate the use of plugins or particular techniques.
Okay.
So kind of how I actually need to write this up, but kind of how I'm starting to think about like the Gatsby monorepo is it's for like Gatsby related infrastructure. So plugins, like data plugins, Webpack plugins, that sort of stuff. Anything that's kind of like the lower levels of building a website, but kind of like more opinionated stuff like, hey, here's like a sweet theme for building like a Gatsby blog or something like that. That's kind of like outside of the Gatsby. But I mean, those are totally useful too. I mean, lots of people build their first Gatsby site based on like what we call like starters. Gatsby starter that somebody's contributed. So those are really awesome. So if you're more of a kind of like, if you enjoy more kind of like the design side of things and you just want to build like a kick-ass, like blog and then build it with Gatsby and then share it with the world, then like building and contributing back like a Gatsby starter would be awesome. If you want to write more, like kind of like infrastructure plugging type, plumbing type, stuff, then like there's lots of Gatsby plugins that need written as well.
Cool. I'll put a link to that in the show notes.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.
Yeah, it was fun.